For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Author Greg Mills joins me to discuss his latest book, Agriculture, Furniture and Marmalade, about Southern African motorsport heroes. You are best known for your books about politics and international relations, most recently Africa's Third Liberation and the best-selling Why Africa is Poor. What inspired you to write a book about Southern African motorsport heroes?
My family's had a long-standing involvement in motor racing. I've raced a lot since I was a boy in karts, and I've always been interested in the history of motorsport. In fact, it's the one side of motor racing that's of particular interest to me. I like the technology, but I also like the personalities. It's a real can-do type sport, particularly in the early years of Southern African motorsport. And of course, there's a long-standing family connection which goes back to those early days.
Tell us more about the title of your book, Agriculture, Furniture and Marmalade.
The title comes from Jody Scheckter, and when he was a young man going to Europe to try and make his fame and his fortune, he received the advice from something of a rough diamond, a man called Jackie Pretorius, who was a Formula One racer in South Africa. And Jackie Pretorius said to him, you know, these English people, they're only going to be impressed if you've got real command of the language. And you have to have lots of big words to impress them. And I'm going to give you 3 big words to impress them, and you must use them all the time and preferably in conjunction with one another: agriculture, furniture and marmalade. And Jody Scheckter told the story, of course, with very much a smile on his face, because it was very much the character that Jackie Pretorius was. And it was almost a sort of I suppose, extremely sort of dry sense of humour in perhaps misleading or leading on a young man such as Jody Scheckter at the time. But it's also, I think, a sign of the times. These were simpler times. They were more naive times in many respects. And this was a time, of course, that motorsport was very dangerous. It was a time that most people made their own motor cars. They certainly prepared their own motor cars. So it was much more rough and ready, and the characters were much more rough and ready too.
Your grandfather, Billy Mills, was a famous racing driver. Please tell us more about his driving career.
Well, he was, of course, a pre-war racing driver, which is even more rough and ready. He was better known for his record-breaking efforts. In those days, there wasn't much motor racing in the 1920s. And so they used to do these record-breaking efforts, say, between Pietermaritzburg and Durban, or famously between Cape Town and Johannesburg, and Durban and Johannesburg. And he was best known for that, always setting new records. Of course, like, speed limits didn't clearly exist then, and they were mainly troubled not by people with radar guns, but by people by flat tires, because the cars were, of course, very basic. And then he went on to participate in a number of the early South African Grand Prix, and in 1936 finished 6th in the South African Grand Prix. And in fact, a few years ago, I recreated/rebuilt his 1936 South African Grand Prix car, which was known as the Pi Royal Special. And that was a fun thing to do, which I did with my father. So it's part of that history and part of that interest in rebuilding things. I suppose it's led me not only to write the book, but also to try and keep that spirit of historic racing alive in South Africa. And historic motorsport is not just about nostalgia. It's also about it also has extreme following around the world. I mean, one of the biggest motorsport events now is the Goodwood Festival and Revival, which take place in the United Kingdom. They attract more than 100,000 spectators in a single day. It is one of the most oversubscribed events around. I mean, historic motorsport is probably the growing category of motorsport today, because it has a lot of the history. It has a lot of the cars that people can relate to. They can relate to the technology. The technology is more like the car in their driveway. It's less like something from outer space, which is what a modern Formula One car is. So it's partly that's also driven this interest forward.
Who, in your opinion, are the greatest racing drivers that South Africa has ever produced?
The obvious answer to that is to say Jody Scheckter, because he is the one driver who has won a Formula One Grand Prix and indeed a Formula One World Championship in 1979 for Ferrari, and he was consistently excellent all through his Grand Prix career from when he first burst onto the scene in 1972. So, you know, he, I think, stands head and shoulders in terms of all those abilities, not just as a driver, but as a manager, as a person who's had an incredible career after Grand Prix racing. He made a fortune in a high technology business in America after his driving career, and then now is a very well-known organic farmer living in the UK. So he's excelled at virtually everything that he has done, and I think that provides you with an indication of his abilities, both in and outside the cockpit. But there are lots of drivers who had lots of ability in the cockpit, in particular, and who never made it for a variety of reasons. I mean, some of them are just simply bad luck. Some of it's bad luck that you manufacture, because I suppose you manufacture bad luck like you manufacture good luck. Many of them are not going to be common to South Africans. I think Desiree Wilson, who's the only woman to have won a Formula One race, and who hailed from Johannesburg and now lives in the United States, I think was an outstanding talent. She didn't have the right brakes. There was a lot of prejudice against her because she was a woman. But of all the women, I think, who have burst onto the racing scene, she's probably been the most capable, and I think that's widely acknowledged. And she was very unlucky not to have made it at that top level, at the level of Formula One, although she did do very well in sports cars and at Le Mans as well. People like Kenny Gray, an outstanding talent. Rory Byrne, who was also South African and is covered in the book, and who was a Ferrari and Benetton designer, and who's won, over 100 Grand Prix, or his cars have won over 100 Grand Prix, says that Kenny was one of the greatest talents ever. And again, misfortune really led his career in a particular direction. Although he excelled in the lower formula in the UK, he never made it in the higher formula, just because of bad luck and bad brakes. I think it's not just in driving, but we've had a lot of other talent in South Africa, people who have made it. So we tend to focus on the drivers. We tend to say, oh, it's Schechter or Ian Schechter who have made it, but we don't ever look at the people underneath, or perhaps the people who are preparing the cars. And we've had some outstanding talent there. I've mentioned Rory Byrne already, Gordon Murray, who was the McLaren designer and Brabham designer, hailing from Durban, Ken Howes, who's the Hendrick Motorsport, who are the NASCAR dominant team in the United States. He's also from Johannesburg. He's been their top technical guy for many years. There's a whole variety of people who are in different fields of motorsport, more on the technical side, who have done as well, just that they don't get quite the same credit that the drivers do. So I think that South Africa's motorsport record, racing at home, producing the drivers, producing the engineers, the mechanics, the fabricators, the talent who have really gone on to excel in the country and outside the country, is evidence of the strength of many things. It's evidence of the strength of our education. It's evidence of the competitiveness that South Africans have imbued within them. It's evidence of the enormous number of tracks that we've had. We have great strength in the number of tracks across the country. This linkage with industry, the fact that we had a domestic car manufacturing industry certainly helped. My grandfather assembled cars in the 1920s, was one of the early plants, and from that grew his own motorsport activities, and that has continued today. I mean, having a domestic motor vehicle industry is a very strong link for the sport. And all of those linkages, I think, and I think also our weather has played a part. It does help because it's a sport that requires good weather, and South Africa has a tremendous asset in that regard. And in fact, one that we probably don't employ fully, because the off-season advantage for the Northern Hemisphere, for the Europeans and North Americans, is that they should be coming here like they used to in the 60s and 70s to race during our summer months. And we don't really do that like we used to do it. And we probably could make more of that as a natural advantage, because this is a big money business, this is a big money industry, lots of spectator following, lots of television following, and we could probably do more with that.
Do you see a bright future for South African motorsports?
I think we do. I think I do. I think we do have a bright future. I think that we have these advantages. We have all these tracks. We have great weather, but we do need application. I think over the past 30 years, we have divided our efforts tremendously. I think that we have many categories, probably too many categories of motorsport. Everybody wants to be a champion, and they always go off and seem to make another category so they can become a champion. And I think the old days, South Africa was the only country in the world that had a Formula One World Championship outside the World Formula One Championship. That lasted until the mid-1970s. So the extraordinary rich history of top-line racing in this country And why was that successful? Well, it was successful because we had one category, people could focus their attention on it. The public could relate to, just a few categories. They knew who was who. Now it's very dispersed. So I think a level of tough organisation is required. And you see that sort of the benefits of that organisation in things like off-road, where we have done very well. I mean, we've just come now from a second place in Dakar with Janelle de Villiers and the Toyota team. A tremendous achievement from a car which is built in Johannesburg. Took on the world, and but for bad luck, we would probably would have two cars in the top 10, and we'll wait and see whether Janelle can step one more place higher next year. There's no reason to suggest why he can't. The car is good enough, and he's certainly good enough. So we can do it, and there's a very strong base of off-road racing in South Africa, which has produced that has pushed up that talent, both engineering talent and driving talent. So we need to emulate that in other areas as well, on track motorsport. But I think we need a degree of consolidation, and for that you need management and leadership, and somebody to be able to have a vision and to try and push it through. Of course, it's seen as a minority sport in an era where people want to focus on football or boxing or rugby or cricket, where there's a much greater mass following. But I think motorsport, as Formula One has shown, and the viewership figures are reach into the billions, there is a global following for it, and we just need to try and find the right formula, pardon the pun, to be able to tap into that.
Can you tell us how your preparations for an African entry into Le Mans are coming along? Will you be one of the drivers of the racing car?
Well, let me answer the second part first. I hope so, is the answer. I think I have to get fitter and spend a bit more time in a car. We had a very successful outing at the end of last year in East London. I teamed up with Eddie Kaizan, the Formula Grand Prix driver, and we were able to win the race in the sports car that we have for the event. So there's life in the old dog yet, but I would happily step back if there was somebody much faster than me. Really, the Le Mans of effort is about showing what is possible as much as anything else. It's certainly an ambition of mine. It's certainly always been something that I wanted to do. But it's also a way of showing that we can do these things. We can actually, if we pull together and bring the right components together, we can actually deliver a South African car or an African car to Le Mans. The car has been built. We're busy finalizing the aerodynamics, which is about 80% of the performance today of any car. So what happens is the aerodynamic modeling all happens digitally, and then it goes into a wind tunnel. It's called computational fluid dynamics. You can do multiple permutations of a design within a digital framework, and then be able, without having to have the cost of producing a wind tunnel model. So we're doing that at the moment. But the car is built, and the engine is being developed at the moment, which is a Toyota engine. And so there's and the drivers will be all South African or African. We have planned a couple of races this year, and I think that with that sort of base, we'll be able to launch a proper effort for 2014. So no, it's underway, and it's small steps. It's a great elephant, and we really are trying to eat it from the toes up, but we are making some progress.
Thank you for your time. That was Greg Mills discussing his latest book about South African motorsport heroes.